On the Senate floor Tuesday, Senator Dick Durbin touted the Inflation Reduction Act. President Joe Biden in August signed the climate, health, and tax bill that he called, quote, one of the most significant laws in U.S. history. Senator Durbin touted the law's investment in lowering the cost of prescription drugs. The Inflation Reduction Act will also allow Medicare to negotiate the price of certain prescription drugs. Durbin vowed, quote, the days of Big Pharma raising prices they charge seniors at 5 or 10 times the rate of inflation are over.
Senator from Illinois.
Are we in a quorum call?
Senate is in a quorum call.
Consent the quorum call be suspended, please.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'd like to do something unusual on the floor of the Senate. I'd like to report some good news. It isn't often we have those reports. Today I have 3 items in my news that I'd like to share with people who are following this. Start my remarks by sharing an incredible story from the other side of the world. In May 2020, as the world was reeling from the spread of a deadly new strain of coronavirus, the Red Cross Society in the African nation of Kenya received 500 bicycles from a Chicago-based non-governmental organization known as World Bicycle Relief. Community health workers use these bicycles to make house visits across southern Kenya, providing health services to remote communities who would otherwise not be reached because of restrictions on movement due to COVID-19. In Malawi, young girls use these bicycles to get safely to and from school. And when COVID-19 closed the schools down, girls like 17-year-old Elizabeth were able to shift focus to help her parents, who are farmers, weather the economic effects of the pandemic. She used her bicycle to take the produce to the market. Stories like these are common around the world, showing the value of a simple, relatively inexpensive, green, and easy-to-repair means of mobility, a bicycle, to help meet important development objectives. Since its founding in 2005, World Bicycle Relief of Chicago has done great work helping displaced survivors after a natural disaster in Sri Lanka, allowing farmers to move crops in Zambia, and getting girls to go to school in Malawi. I've even seen myself how a bicycle ambulance in rural Tanzania can change lives. And not long ago, my staff saw the group's efforts in Kenya, where more than 25,000 sustainable, rugged bicycles have been provided. Since 2019, I've been working to push for appropriations through USAID to invest in bicycles, which help meet the needs of healthcare, education, women and girls empowerment, and more. Part of this funding included an in-depth assessment to see what was most useful and how to make the programs locally sustainable. They not only send bikes, they send parts and they train the repairmen. And USAID has used these lessons and opportunities with increasing success thanks to the work of many groups, including World Bicycle Relief of Chicago. Well, today I'm introducing legislation partnering with the king of the bicycle world and the U.S. House of Representatives, Representative Earl Blumenauer of Oregon. Our bill is going to codify these important efforts and formalize the creation of a mobility program within USAID's Office of Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. COVID-19 has taught us that a global health crisis can easily turn into an economic crisis, a food crisis, a mobility crisis, and more. Sometimes the simplest things, like a bicycle, can help make incredible progress. That's item number 1. Item number 2, for decades, Americans have paid the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. On average, we pay nearly 4 times more than the people in Canada and other Western nations for exactly the same drug. This price gouging by Big Pharma hurts Americans' health and their financial security. I have stories sent to me from time to time from people I represent, especially senior citizens, who tell me what these sky-high prescription drug prices force them to choose between medications and other basic necessities like food and shelter. Philip is one of those stories. He lives in a small town south of Chicago, 73 years old and a diabetic. After several heart and back surgeries, he can't work any longer. He takes several medications regularly. Now you're going to recognize the name of one of them. It's called Trulicity. If you watch TV, you've heard that one. A non-insulin treatment that he uses to control his blood sugar and manage his diabetes. Trulicity. Do you know what a 1-month prescription costs for Trulicity? $2,000. So what does Philip do, who can't work and has a fixed income? He tries to cut the pills in half to make his prescription last longer. Sometimes he just skips the medication altogether. He is not alone. 1 in 5 Americans do not take their medications as prescribed because they're too expensive. In Philip's case, even that isn't enough. At the end of the day, he had to refinance his home. What a time to do it, huh, with the interest rates? Because here in America, for too long, we found it acceptable to allow pharmaceutical companies to charge what they wish. Not anymore. We pressed for decades. Both Democrats and Republicans gave these speeches. This was not just a Democratic issue. To lower prescription drugs, at least for seniors. Last month we did it, right here on the floor of the Senate. The Inflation Reduction Act, which Congress passed without a single Republican vote, is delivering real relief now for families struggling with high prices. A few minutes ago, the Republican leader was on the floor telling us what a terrible bill that was, the Inflation Reduction Act. He didn't mention the fact that it's going to do some remarkable things. It makes historic investments to address the climate crisis. That's one thing. It includes investments in renewable, affordable energy sources. That's certainly needed. These investments in renewable energy could save families hundreds of dollars a year in energy cost. That's real relief. Just as an aside, last month, my wife and I decided to put solar panels on our home in Springfield, Illinois. We're not the first in our town, but we're certainly the first in our neighborhood. They predict it'll reduce our electric bill by 85% a month. Think about your own electric bill and what that would mean, money in hand. And there are tax credits to put on solar panels. How did we achieve that and put tax credits in for heat pumps and electric water heaters? In the Inflation Reduction Act, which Senator McConnell just came to the floor and said was a terrible bill. I think you're going to see more and more Americans making the choice our family made. I think they should. The Inflation Reduction Act also is going to lower health care costs, one of the biggest items in every family's budget. First, begin to let Medicare negotiate fair prices for medications used by seniors. Is that a radical idea, that a federal agency, on behalf of the people it serves, negotiates for lower drug prices? It's an idea that's been at work in the Veterans Administration for years. The VA, our VA, serving our veterans, men and women who serve this country, pays on average half of what Medicare pays for exactly the same drugs now, because VA could negotiate and Medicare could not. The bill which Senator McConnell took exception to now gives Medicare the power to negotiate lower prices for seniors. 83% of Americans think that's a pretty good idea. How do we get 83% of Americans to agree on anything? They agree on that, that's a good idea. 71% of the people from the party of the senator from Kentucky. Second, the Inflation Reduction Act will cap the price Medicare recipients pay for insulin, $35 a month for Medicare recipients. That's the limit. And it limits seniors' out-of-pocket expenses for all medications to $2,000 a year. Remember Phil? Phil was paying $2,000 a month for Trulicity. Under this bill, which we passed here a month ago, without a single vote from the other side of the aisle, we're going to limit seniors' responsibility under Medicare for prescription drugs to $2,000 a year. By the way, I believe we should cap the cost of insulin at $35 a month for everybody, not just seniors. Guess what radical nation, what socialist nation does that? Canada. Canada does it, and pharmaceutical companies still make a healthy profit. They just don't make a killing on a life-saving drug. Third, the Inflation Reduction Act will curb the outrageous cost increases that Medicare beneficiaries pay for medications. It does that by tying prescription drug price increases to the cost of living. Pharmaceutical companies that raise their prices faster are going to pay a penalty if they do. The days of Big Pharma raising prices they charge seniors at 5 or 10 times the rate of inflation are over. Of course, the pharmaceutical giants and their lobbyists fought us every step of the way. They said, you put limits on the prices we can charge, and we're going to have to cut our research. Guess what they didn't tell you, and what our colleagues on the other side of the aisle do not admit? It isn't true. Studies have found that Big Pharma could lose $1 trillion in sales over the next decade, and it would still remain the most profitable industry in America. By the way, did you know these pharmaceutical companies spend more money on advertising and marketing than they do on research? Point two, did you know that the research that they're using is based on research started at the National Institute of Health at the expense of American taxpayers? And I'm all for the National Institutes of Health. They use what the NIH develops to make new drugs. It's a good thing to do, and they're very profitable as they do it. So I don't want to hear that they can charge less and they're not going to be able to survive. I don't believe it. And it's not only seniors who will save on health care costs. More than 14 million Americans who receive their health coverage through the Affordable Care Act marketplace will save hundreds, even thousands of dollars on their monthly insurance premiums because of the Inflation Reduction Act. Under the American Rescue Plan, we lowered monthly premiums for middle-income families and those with ACA health plans. The Inflation Reduction Act will continue this for another 3 years, and I hope I'm here to renew it. No one should go without medical care ever, but especially not when we're fighting a worldwide pandemic. Not only did our Republican colleagues vote against what I've just described to you, lowering monthly premiums for families nationwide, they went further and tried every way they could think to gut the Affordable Care Act. 2 weeks ago, a federal judge in the Northern District of Texas ruled that the Affordable Care Act's requirement that health plans offer free preventive health services like vaccinations was unconstitutional. In 2020, because of the ACA, 152 million Americans received these preventive health services with no out-of-pocket cost, often resulting in the early detection of cancer, heart disease, and other serious conditions. Now a group of Texas residents and businesses argue that that just violates their basic religious liberty. Religious liberty. And they picked a judge who's been friendly to them in the past. The same judge in northern Texas ruled that the Affordable Care Act was unconstitutional. That was overturned by the Supreme Court, thank goodness. 12 years after the ACA became law, it's long past time for both parties to support this effort, which provides health insurance for millions of Americans at affordable cost. We need to bring down the cost of health care and prescription drugs for all American families. The last item of good news comes from a blog which I read rather religiously, and it's a lady in Maine, Heather Cox Richardson. Almost every day she publishes a column for those who want to read it. And I don't know if there's a subscription cost. She asks from time to time if you want to contribute to her effort. I do. Well, today's is one that I think is worth reading and remembering. And she says, a headline in the New York Times read, "Factory jobs are booming like it's the 1970s." The story explained that more money in the hands of consumers thanks to federal stimulus spending, along with the new skepticism of stretched supply lines, has created a rebound in American manufacturing. Since 1970, outsourcing and automation have meant that every recession has seen factory jobs disappear in America and never return. Well, there's good news. We now know that we have not only regained all the manufacturing jobs lost during the pandemic, we've added 67,000 more. Those numbers would be higher if the labor market weren't so tight, a condition leading employers to offer higher wages and better benefits. And the other point that she makes that's worth noting is that the National Economic Council Director, Brian Deese, told reporters one of the most striking things we're seeing is that American companies are committing to build and expand right here at home because of supply chain concerns. Meanwhile, get this, the real net worth of the bottom 50% of U.S. households has climbed 60% in the last year and a half, now reaching $67,524. Inflation is a problem. Don't get me wrong. It's a challenge. Gasoline prices seem to be creeping down, at least in the Midwest. I can't speak for all over the country. Food prices are still too high. I've been to the supermarket over the weekend. I know what's going on. But we are seeing some evidence of progress on the economic front, and I certainly hope that's continued. Mr. President, I ask consent that this column by Heather Cox Richardson be included in my remarks.
Without objection.
Without objection, I ask consent to yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.